Welcome to the Kemetamorphysis podcast, where we explore the possibility and processes of personal and community transformation based on the ancient wisdom of Kemet, one of many classical African civilizations, as a foundation. In our first episode, Baba Derrick Jackson talked about the importance of beginnings. His beginnings with Imani Temple, the transformation or metamorphosis during a pilgrimage to Egypt, leading up to an incident that would pave the way for the beginning of Christ's Universal Temple. Baba Derrick recalls.
I became a priest of the temple, and then an incident happened, which we can talk about at another time, that there were some of us at Imani Temple who had to separate from the AACC.
Now he walks us through the incident, a test of Maat, leadership, and self-determination. Okay, so you mentioned that Mama Yvonne and the renegades, or should I say Mama Yvonne and the other renegades were in the basement. What were you doing on Sunday?
I was at Imani Temple conducting Sunday services because I was still their priest. I hadn't resigned or gave up my position as the priest pastor of Imani Temple at that time. It wouldn't be for about another month before I separated myself away from Imani Temple.
How many people were in the basement?
About 10 people, okay. 10, 11 people.
And when you leave Imani Temple, what does that look like?
Well, it's interesting that let me back up and say what created the split was the Archbishop coming to that Sunday service and accusing people of things that did not happen, and still having a little Harlemite in me, that street kind of side of me came out when he was standing in front of me talking to the congregation, accusing them of things that did not happen. So, my discipline in not reacting to something that's happening in front of me did not kick in. But what kicked in was the idea is you never let someone come and talk to your people in that way without first coming to you. I thought that was disrespect to the highest order. And that wasn't just from Harlem, but my Air Force military days taught you that also, that does not happen without you stepping up and letting your people know you got their back. And so when I stepped up to the Archbishop, people had never saw me in an angry manner. They had never saw me raise my voice. My wife and my daughter had never saw me raise my voice in anger. And so they were everybody in the room got in shock when I stood up and confronted him as if I was about to be physical with him, which I never was going to be that. And it created chaos in that room, me making that kind of move. Well, at first, nobody moved because they couldn't believe what they were viewing. And all of a sudden, you know how you watch these movies and people like in a silo, and they're looking around themselves. And that's what I felt. Like I had entered this silo and I'm now viewing the room created by me confronting the Archbishop that way. And I saw my wife and my daughter crying. And they were crying because they never saw that side of me, right? Never. And that humbled me immediately. Where I sat, I went back, sat down, noticed the chaos all around, and said, Derrick, you caused this. There was a different way you could have handled it. And that conversation I had with myself, I got up, walked over to the Archbishop, put my hand out, and I apologized for creating the chaos in the room. And then asked to speak to him in private. Now, my wife and other members who were backing me were upset that I did that because they wanted to, let's say, verbalize their feelings and emotions about what had just occurred. And they let me know they didn't like the fact that I did that. But I, in that moment, Dr. Adams, said to myself, my art is testing me. Am I going to allow what happened caused by an action that I did continue, or what am I going to do about it to straighten it out? So let me just say this. I went into the room with the Archbishop, apologized for what I did, but I wasn't apologizing for the argument I was making. And he knew that clearly because I said to him in private, you should have came to me. All of this that's what happened tonight was because as the priest of the temple, your first contact would have should have been with me, not with somebody in the congregation, accusing people of something that never happened.
What do you think you would have done differently, hindsight being 2020?
Whispered in to him, let's have a private conversation. Walk up and whisper, okay, there's some things you got wrong. Can you and I have a conversation in the back? Rather than being angry. Because the more he talked, the angrier I got.
Do you think that it's possible for my art to be restored? That there had to be some chaos?
Well, looking back at it with 20/30 hindsight, it's not always 20/20. Yeah, my art needed the disorder because the one thing I've learned about Kemet is out of what we call disorder and confusion comes order.
Ask that because sometimes, even if there's a change in energy in a space, sometimes we will power through.
Mm-hmm.
We will power through, and then something very chaotic or dramatic happens, but maybe it needed to happen in order for the separation to take place.
I see it now, but at the time, I'm dealing with real time, and in that real time, you're making decisions rapidly. It may have sounded like I'm taking my time, but these things were happening rapidly. And so the thing that really took Archbishop Stallings out is when I said in that meeting with him in the back, I'm going to silence myself until we meet in 3 weeks in Washington, D.C. We had a meeting scheduled for all of the priests around the country because Imani Temple was in several other states. And so all the priest pastors were going to meet in DC already. And he said, "You going to do what?" I looked at him and said that if we're going to practice Ma'at, then I have to be accountable for what my part in this was. And for right now, I'm going to silence myself. Several things happened in that moment. I took away any power that he had over me in that moment, because that's one of the harshest punishment for a priest is to be silenced. What that means is that I'm not allowed to stand before the congregation and speak. I'm not allowed to conduct any ceremonies or rituals coming forth. So we were about to go into one of the most ritualistic times of the Catholic Church. We were heading to Resurrection Sunday. Okay. The meeting was going to happen after that. And if you know anything about the Catholic Church, they have these, what they call the different stages before the resurrection, and things that you have to do as part of that ritual and ceremony till you get to Resurrection Sunday. So that means the person who was the deacon at the temple at the time is now in charge. I got to show up for every meeting, but I'm not allowed to do anything but sit during those meetings. That was the beginning of the end, as they say, because then now when I go to DC and all the priests are there, his assistant priest, who he had already told about the incident, but what I noticed he didn't tell the assistant priest, is that I had silenced myself. So all that negativeness she was talking about, and she didn't mention my name, but I knew she was talking about me when she brought up an incident occurred, as she says, at one of our temples where one of the priests confronted the archbishop. And I'm saying, okay, you really don't have to do this. But she never mentioned how I silenced myself. And there's at this time about 10 priests sitting around the table. And she looked at me as she was speaking about it. And is there anything you would like to share with us, Baba Derrick? And I said, yes. And I explained how I apologized, and explained how I silenced myself for 3 weeks. And you know how people are leaning in because they're listening to the assistant priest talk about me in a negative kind of way. And that leaning in indicated to me that they ready to hang me out to dry. And then when I said I silenced myself for 3 weeks, the assistant priest went, "You did what?" And all the other priests, like collectively, leaned back in their seat. Like, that's unheard of. You silence yourself for 3 weeks after the incident? I said, if we're going to be about my art, I had to be accountable for my behavior.
I was going to ask you, was that my art or was that your training inside of the Catholic?
No, no. That's why they were surprised.
How did you know to understand my aunt that in that way?
The ancestors taught me, and I learned to listen to my inner voice. And I trained myself to know the difference between my voice and the voice of my ancestors. And they led me in that direction and said to me, if you're going to be about my art, now is the time to demonstrate what it looks like because it will teach you who's aboard, what you're doing, and who's not. And it was a defining moment. In that moment of watching these other priests saying, and they were verbal because we are all priests in that room. I wouldn't have done that because the African American Catholic congregation was supposed to be about African principles. When you looked at their book, they're supposed to be bringing in Kemetic ideas. One of the reasons they brought me there was to teach the priesthood about Kemet, about Maat. And I guess the ancestors wanted me to see I may be serious about it, but you ain't got, you do not have a group of people. They wanted Ma'at in name only, not in deed. So they wanted to be able to talk about Ma'at, but not necessarily be accountable. Because what people don't look at when they talk about Ma'at is the accountability part. Everybody likes to say, oh, Ma'at is truth, justice, righteousness, and they can name the 7 principles, but they never talk about how does it operate every day? What's the accountability in Ma'at to you personally and collectively? And that's what I learned is people like the idea behind it, but they didn't necessarily want to be accountable to it. Although the people who were backing me didn't agree with what I did, they understood though. And they appreciated the fact that I would go the extra mile to show them what it looks like. So the rebels were saying, yeah, I understand where you coming from. And yes, you did probably contribute to everybody that chaos. And now we see that if you're holding yourself accountable in that way, what you're going to expect from us. And they were willing to come under that accountability. So what it did was it showed me who was willing to be accountable in that way and who wasn't. So as you stated earlier, it needed to be done.
Thank you, Baba Derrick, for sharing that message about my aunt. It's such a pleasure to be able to sit with you in this way. And I know that there will be some other people that will be really inspired by the way in which you are walking us through these really important concepts that are talked about at Christ Universal Temple. Thank you so very much. We want to archive something special that was established in 2000, more than 2 decades ago. We will be uploading episodes on the 14th and the 28th of each month. In upcoming episodes, we will be exploring the history of Christ Universal Temple, its teachings on spirituality and personal growth, and its role in the Columbia, South Carolina community. We invite you to like, comment, and subscribe to receive notifications for future episodes. Thank you for listening.